The young black girl warned him in a whisper. The drink was spiked and death was seconds away. Please don't drink that. The words were barely a breath, slipping through the symphony of clinking glasses and polite, lethal laughter. Min-kyu's fingers locked around the stem of his wine glass, his calculating eyes cutting sideways to find a small black girl standing beside his chair. Her pale yellow dress and pink ribbon looked impossibly innocent against the backdrop of armed guards and blood-stained alliances. Her wide, frightened eyes held a certainty that suggested she knew something even his trained security had failed to detect. The child had stepped into a space where seasoned investors wouldn't dare interrupt, bypassing a protection detail engineered to intercept any threat. The Hanul Grand Hotel's banquet hall was thick with the scent of imported wine and the unspoken violence of men who smiled with their mouths but killed with their signatures. Yet every predatory gaze in that glittering room shifted entirely to this little girl whispering into the ear of Seoul's most dangerous man. Beneath the cascade of crystal chandeliers, Min-kyu studied the deep red wine in his glass and then looked back at the child Zola. In his world, a child was either collateral damage or a cleverly disguised weapon. As his thumb traced the rim of the glass, he realized she was neither. She was a prophet of poison, a small voice that had just rewritten his fate. The little black girl wasn't just warning him. She was the reason he would live to see morning. Hello family. Don't skip yet. Where are you watching? Drop your country and state in the comments so I can send special regards to you. And also hit the subscribe button on your screen to subscribe to this channel so you wouldn't miss out on heart-stopping stories of survival, power, and redemption. Now let's dive deep into the story. Min-kyu did not move. His hand remained frozen in the air, the expensive crystal suddenly feeling like a grenade. Around him, the room held its collective breath. The waiters stopped mid-stride. The city officials' laughter died in their throats. Behind him, his security detail tensed, their hands drifting instinctively toward concealed weapons beneath their tailored suits. The girl's warning had been so quiet it was almost imagined, yet it carried the weight of a gunshot in the elegant banquet hall. What makes you say that? Min-kyu asked, his voice a low rasp that had made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. He didn't look at Zola yet. He looked at the wine, imported, expensive, poured personally by the sommelier with a flourish 5 minutes ago. To any other eye, it was flawless, a $3,000 bottle of perfection. But Min-kyu hadn't survived this long by trusting appearances. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a silver cufflink, one he'd once used to test purity in rooms where betrayal wore cologne. With deliberate precision, he dipped it into the wine. The silver darkened instantly, not gradually, not subtly. Instantly, a sharp, collective intake of breath rippled through the room like a shockwave. Chairs scraped against marble. Guards moved. The string quartet's elegant melody fractured into discordant silence. The iron crane finally turned his full attention to the child. Up close, she was even smaller than she'd appeared from across the table. A fragile vision of yellow fabric and carefully sectioned hair held back by a thin headband. She wasn't trembling. Her expression was grave, her small hands clasped together, her focus entirely locked on the poison she had identified. How did you know? Min-kyu asked, his tone stripped of its usual menace, replaced by something rarer, genuine curiosity. Before Zola could answer, a woman lurched forward from the catering staff area. Adana stumbled into the light, her face a canvas of pure, paralyzing terror as she realized her daughter had interrupted the city's most feared power broker during his most vulnerable moment. Sir, Adana gasped, her voice splintering with panic. I'm so sorry. She reached for Zola, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp her daughter's shoulder. She didn't mean to disturb you. Please, she's only 8. She doesn't understand. Min-kyu raised one finger. Silence crashed into the room like a physical force. Adana froze, her protective instinct at war with her survival instinct. She was a mother expecting execution, not gratitude. Min-kyu watched her. The way her body shielded Zola, the way her eyes searched desperately for exits that didn't exist. She wasn't part of this. She was collateral caught in the crossfire of his world. Your daughter, Min-kyu said slowly, his dark eyes shifting back to Zola, just saved my life. The words hung in the air like a verdict. He crouched low, bringing himself to eye level with the child. Tell me, how did you know? Zola swallowed hard, then pointed at the glass with one small finger. It felt hot, she whispered, like when metal sits in the sun too long. But wine isn't supposed to feel hot from far away. Min-kyu stared at her. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't repeating something she'd overheard. She was sensing, perceiving danger through a lens that defied logic. He stood, his expression unreadable, and turned to his lead guard. Lock the doors. Find the server who poured this. Now. Controlled chaos erupted. Men moved with military precision. The room transformed from a banquet hall into a crime scene in seconds. But Min-kyu's attention never left the child. And that was when he understood the real danger. Saving his life had made her visible. In a world where power meant knowing your enemy's every move, Zola had just revealed herself as something far more valuable and far more vulnerable than any weapon he possessed. She could see what others couldn't. And now, so could everyone else. No one interrupted Min-kyu. Not the waiters gliding between tables like shadows. Not the investors pretending not to notice the armed men at the exits. Not even the city officials who laughed too loudly whenever Min-kyu's eyes drifted in their direction. So when a small voice brushed his ear, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Please don't drink that. The banquet hall transformed in seconds. Min-kyu's lead guard barked orders into his earpiece. Heavy doors slammed shut with the finality of a prison cell. The elegant string quartet fell silent mid-note as armed men materialized from the shadows, blocking every exit with practiced efficiency. Crystal chandeliers still glittered overhead, but the room's golden warmth had turned cold. A gilded cage where someone had just tried to commit murder. The sommelier was found in the kitchen, already gone. Cyanide. Quick and decisive. A professional's exit. Min-kyu stood motionless amid the controlled chaos, his attention fixed entirely on the small girl who'd rewritten his evening. He crouched again, bringing himself to her eye level, close enough that Adana flinched but didn't dare pull her daughter away. Zola, he said softly, testing her name on his tongue. Tell me what you felt. The child's eyes, impossibly large and honest, met his without fear. It felt hot, she whispered. Like when you touch a pot on the stove before Mama says it's ready. The glass was cold, but the wine inside felt angry, wrong. Min-kyu tilted his head slightly. You could feel the temperature from across the room? Not temperature, Zola corrected, her small voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. It's more like when something doesn't belong, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. It hurts even though nothing's broken. Behind them, Adana made a strangled sound, half sob, half prayer. She dropped to her knees, still gripping Zola's shoulders. Please, sir, I'm just a caterer. We're nobody. My daughter. She has a vivid imagination, but she means no harm. I promise we won't say anything to anyone. Just let us go home. Min-kyu finally looked at her. Really looked. Adana's uniform was pressed but inexpensive. Her hands bore the small scars of kitchen work. Her eyes held no calculation, no hidden agenda. Only the raw, primal terror of a mother who just watched her child step into the crosshairs of something deadly. She wasn't part of this. She was collateral, which made her vulnerable. You can't go home, Min-kyu said quietly. The words fell like a death sentence. The poison came from someone I trust, he continued, standing slowly. Someone close enough to know my schedule, my preferences, my vulnerabilities. They failed tonight because of your daughter, which means they now know what she can do. Adana's face drained of color. No. No, please. They will come for her, Min-kyu interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion but heavy with certainty. Not because she saw anything, because she can sense anything. That makes her the most dangerous witness in Seoul. We'll leave the city, Adana pleaded. We'll disappear. Just let us. My enemies don't miss twice. Minkyu gestured toward his guards. And they don't leave witnesses. They didn't go home that night. The armored convoy was a procession of black vehicles with windows too dark to see through and doors too thick to break. Adana clutched Zola to her chest in the back seat, her body trembling as Seoul's glittering skyline blurred past them. "We're prisoners," she whispered, more to herself than to Minkyu, who sat across from them with the stillness of a predator at rest. "You're alive," he corrected. "There's a difference." "For how long?" Minkyu didn't answer. The question was fair, and he respected her enough not to lie. The convoy climbed higher, away from the city's neon heart, toward the hillside where Minkyu's estate carved into the mountain like a fortress. Steel gates opened at their approach. Armed men bowed as they passed. The architecture was brutalist, all clean lines and reinforced concrete designed to withstand sieges, not impress guests. Zola pressed her small face against the bulletproof glass, her breath fogging the window. "It's very quiet here," she murmured, her voice carrying a strange observation that settled uncomfortably in the silence. Minkyu glanced at her. "Quiet keeps people alive." Zola turned from the window, her expression oddly solemn for a child. "Not always." The words hung between them as the convoy rolled to a stop. Adana looked at the fortress surrounding them, the guards, the walls, the absolute isolation, and understood with crushing clarity that protection and captivity wore the same face. They were safe. They were trapped. And somewhere in the darkness, the people who tried to kill Minkyu were already planning their next move. 3 days passed like a held breath. The estate existed in a state of beautiful, suffocating stillness. Marble floors gleamed beneath Zola's bare feet as she wandered hallways lined with abstract art worth more than most people's homes. Adana followed her daughter like a shadow, unable to relax even when Minkyu's staff assured her they were safe. Safe felt like a word that had lost its meaning. Zola didn't seem afraid. That was what unsettled Adana most. Her daughter moved through Minkyu's fortress with the curious detachment of someone reading a book in a language only she understood. She'd pause at doorways, tilt her head, then move on. She'd touch walls and flinch. She'd watch guards pass and whisper observations that made no logical sense. "That man is sad," she'd say, pointing at a stone-faced security officer who showed no emotion. "This room feels like shouting," she'd murmur in a library where no one had spoken in hours. Minkyu noticed everything. He watched from his study as Zola stood in the garden, staring at a koi pond with an intensity that suggested she was seeing more than fish. He observed the way she recoiled from certain staff members, not out of fear, but instinct. How she'd gravitate toward others with an ease that made his guards uncomfortable. "She reads people like seismographs read earthquakes," Minkyu remarked to his head of security one morning. The man shifted uneasily. "It's unnatural, sir." "It's extraordinary," Minkyu corrected, though his tone carried no warmth, just calculation. By the third evening, Adana found Minkyu standing outside their assigned quarters. She froze, instinctively stepping between him and the door where Zola slept. "You're using her," Adana said quietly, accusation sharpening her exhaustion. "I see it. You watch her like she's equipment." Minkyu's expression remained unreadable. "I'm trying to understand her." "Why?" "So you can weaponize an 8-year-old. The words hung in the air like smoke. Minkyu didn't deny it. He couldn't. The truth was more complicated and more damning than Adana knew. He'd already begun adjusting his decisions based on Zola's reactions. When she'd frowned at a proposed meeting location, he'd changed venues. When she'd smiled at one of his advisors, he'd increased that man's clearance level. A child's intuition was reshaping his empire. "Your daughter sees patterns others miss," Minkyu said finally. "She senses intent before it becomes action. That's not a gift, Adana. It's a superpower in a world built on deception." "She's a child," Adana hissed. "Not your oracle." Minkyu met her eyes. "Then tell her to stop being right." The breaking point came during dinner. Minkyu had summoned his inner circle, 5 lieutenants who controlled different sectors of his operations. The dining room was tense with unspoken hierarchies and barely concealed ambitions. Zola sat beside her mother, drawing invisible patterns on the table with her finger, seemingly oblivious to the dangerous men around her. Halfway through the meal, she leaned toward Min-kyu. "The man in the gray suit," she whispered, her voice so quiet only he could hear. "His heart is racing, but he's pretending it isn't." Min-kyu's chopsticks paused mid-air. He didn't look at Sung-min, his logistics coordinator, a man who'd been with him for 7 years. "What else?" he asked Zola, his tone conversational but his attention razor-sharp. "He keeps touching his wrist," Zola continued, her young eyes tracking something invisible. "Right here." She touched her own wrist, like checking if time is moving. "He's scared of what he already did." The room didn't know Zola had spoken. The conversation continued, talk of shipments and territories and profit margins. But Min-kyu heard nothing except the thundering implication of a child's observation. He set down his chopsticks with deliberate care. "Sung-min," Min-kyu said, his voice slicing through the dinner conversation like a blade. "Tell me about the sommelier." The room went silent. Sung-min looked up, confusion flickering across his face. Or perhaps it was panic disguised as confusion. "Sir, the one who poisoned my wine," Min-kyu clarified, leaning back in his chair. "How long had you known him?" Sung-min's hand drifted to his wrist. A nervous gesture. Unconscious. Damning. I don't understand the question," Sung-min stammered. Min-kyu asked 3 more questions. Sung-min answered too quickly each time. The arrest was swift, violent, final. Adana watched in horror as guards dragged a screaming man from the dining room. The other lieutenants sat frozen, calculating their own survival odds. Min-kyu remained perfectly still, his expression revealing nothing. Only Zola moved. She turned in her chair and looked at her mother, her small face crumpling with an emotion too complex for her age. Guilt. She'd done this. Her words had sentenced a man. That night, Min-kyu stood outside Zola's room and heard her crying softly through the door. Not from fear, but from the crushing weight of consequences she was too young to carry. He didn't knock, didn't offer comfort. He simply stood there, listening, and wondered if protecting her meant keeping her close or letting her go before his world destroyed what was left of her innocence. The dining room was designed for intimidation disguised as elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Seoul's glittering sprawl. The table, a single slab of black walnut, stretched long enough to seat 12 but tonight held only 6. No weapons visible, no raised voices, just maps, data tablets, and the kind of tension that preceded either breakthrough or bloodshed. Min-kyu sat at the head, flanked by his 5 most trusted lieutenants. Men who controlled districts, smuggling routes, information networks. Men who'd killed for him and would die for him, or so the arrangement claimed. Adana and Zola sat apart from the main gathering, positioned near the window like ornamental guests. Adana's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her jaw clenched with barely contained frustration. She'd insisted they stay in their quarters. Min-kyu had insisted otherwise. "She needs to see how business works," he'd said, as if that justified parading an 8-year-old through a criminal strategy session. Zola seemed unaffected by the adult tensions swirling around her. She sat cross-legged on her chair, too small for the formal dining seat, drawing invisible shapes on the polished table with one finger. Her eyes wandered, tracking the servants who refilled water glasses, following the subtle shifts in body language as men debated territorial adjustments and profit margins. To anyone watching casually, she looked bored. Min-kyu knew better. The meeting progressed with surgical efficiency. Territory disputes in Gangnam, a shipping delay in Busan, information about a rival family's movements. Sung-min, the logistics coordinator in the gray suit, presented quarterly projections with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times. His numbers were flawless, his delivery smooth, but halfway through his presentation, Zola shifted. She stopped drawing. Her small body went still in a way that made Adana's protective instincts flare. Then, slowly, Zola slid off her chair and walked across the room with the quiet determination of a child on a mission. The conversation faltered. Every eye tracked her movement as she approached Min-kyu's chair and stood on her tiptoes, leaning close to his ear. Her whisper was a ghost of sound. The man in the gray suit. His heart is racing, but he's pretending it isn't. Min-kyu's expression didn't change. He continued looking at the projection on the tablet before him as if Zola hadn't spoken. But his fingers stilled on the glass surface. Zola wasn't finished. He keeps touching his wrist. Right here. She touched her own small wrist. Like he's checking something that isn't there. He's scared of what he already did. The room held its breath without knowing why. Min-kyu finally looked up from the tablet. His dark eyes found Sung-min across the table. A man who'd served him faithfully for 7 years. A man who controlled supply chains worth millions. A man whose face had gone just slightly pale. Sung-min, Min-kyu said, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone asking about the weather. The sommelier who served me at the Hanul Grand. Did you recommend him for that event? The question landed like a grenade with the pin pulled. Sung-min blinked. I what? No, sir. That was handled by the venue's management. Strange, Min-kyu continued, leaning back in his chair. Because the venue manager told my people you specifically requested him. Called him trustworthy. I may have mentioned him in passing, but... And you were in the kitchen 15 minutes before service began. Why? Sung-min's hand moved to his wrist. The gesture was unconscious, automatic. A tell so obvious it might as well have been a confession written in neon. I was checking on food quality. Standard protocol for high profile. How much did they pay you? The room crystallized into absolute silence. Sung-min's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed. When he spoke again, the words came too fast. The desperate scramble of a man watching his carefully constructed lies collapse in real time. Min-kyu, I swear on my family, I would never. Your family is in Singapore, Min-kyu interrupted quietly. They've been there for 3 weeks. Interesting timing. The other lieutenants were already moving. Chairs scraping back, bodies positioning themselves away from the contaminated man. Self-preservation was a language they all spoke fluently. Sung-min lunged to his feet, hands raised. Please, just listen. Min-kyu nodded once. Guards materialized from the shadows. The struggle was brief and brutal. Sung-min's screams echoed through the dining room as he was dragged toward the door, his expensive shoes scraping uselessly against marble floors. You're making a mistake, he shrieked. I'm loyal. I've always been. The door slammed shut, severing his protests. The remaining lieutenants sat frozen, their eyes sliding toward Zola. This small girl in a yellow dress who just unmasked a traitor with nothing but whispered observations. The calculation in their gazes was unmistakable. She'd become the most dangerous person in the room. Adana stood abruptly, her chair clattering backward. Zola, come here. Now. Her voice shook with barely controlled fury. She grabbed her daughter's hand and pulled her toward the door, her entire body trembling with rage and terror in equal measure. Min-kyu watched them go without expression. In the hallway, away from the guards and the lieutenants and the man who just weaponized her child, Adana finally broke. You used her, she hissed, spinning to face Min-kyu as he emerged from the dining room. You paraded my daughter in front of murderers and made her pick out the traitor like she's some kind of bloodhound. She saved lives tonight, Min-kyu replied calmly. She's 8 years old. Adana's voice cracked. She's not your weapon. She's not your tool. She's a child who doesn't understand what you just made her do. Min-kyu had no answer, because Adana was right. That night, Min-kyu stood outside Zola's room, his hand raised to knock but never completing the gesture. Through the door, he heard her crying soft, hiccuping sobs that carried the weight of guilt no child should bear. She wasn't crying because she was scared. She was crying because a man had been dragged away screaming, and her words had made it happen. Min-kyu lowered his hand. For the first time in years, he felt something uncomfortably close to shame. The explosions came at dawn. The first blast tore through the eastern perimeter wall with a sound like the world splitting open. Min-kyu was awake instantly, Years of survival instinct didn't allow for grogginess or hesitation. Alarms shrieked through the estate's corridors. Emergency lights bathed everything in pulsing red. Through his reinforced windows, he saw fire blooming against the pale morning sky. They'd found him. Of course they had. Betrayal always left breadcrumbs. Gunfire erupted. Not the sharp cracks of pistols, but the sustained roar of automatic weapons. His security detail was already engaged, their tactical training evident in the coordinated return fire. But the attackers had come prepared. Multiple entry points, military-grade explosives. This wasn't opportunistic violence. This was calculated extermination. Ming-Qiu moved with lethal efficiency, grabbing the pistol from his nightstand and sprinting into the hallway. Guards rushed past, taking defensive positions. Smoke drifted through ventilation systems. Somewhere below, glass shattered in cascading waves. His first thought wasn't his vault or his escape route or his empire. It was Zola. He found Adana in the hallway outside their quarters, frozen in her nightgown, clutching Zola to her chest. The child's eyes were wide but eerily calm, as if she'd sensed this coming long before the first explosion. "Move," Ming-Qiu commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Adana didn't argue. Terror had stripped away her defiance. She ran beside him as he led them through the labyrinth of corridors toward the safe room. A reinforced bunker buried in the estate's core, designed to withstand everything short of a nuclear strike. Another explosion rocked the building. Closer this time. Debris rained from the ceiling. Ming-Qiu shielded them both with his body, feeling concrete dust settle on his shoulders like premature burial ash. They reached the safe room's entrance, a vault door disguised as a wine cellar panel. Ming-Qiu's fingerprint activated the mechanism. Heavy steel began to slide open with hydraulic precision. "Inside," he ordered. Adana stumbled through, pulling Zola with her. The room beyond was sterile and small. Reinforced walls, emergency supplies, communications equipment. A tomb designed for survival. Zola turned at the threshold, her small hand reaching out to grasp Ming-Qiu's sleeve. "Are you coming back?" The question stopped him cold. Above them, the battle raged. Men were dying for him. His empire was under siege. Every instinct screamed at him to seal this door and join the fight. But Zola's eyes held a weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with trust. A commodity Ming-Qiu hadn't valued in years. He knelt, bringing himself to her level one more time. "I promise." The words tasted foreign on his tongue. Ming-Qiu didn't make promises. He made calculations, threats, transactions. But staring into this child's face, this girl who'd saved his life and paid for it with her innocence, something fundamental shifted. "I promise," he repeated, softer this time, as if speaking to himself. Then he stood, stepped back, and sealed the vault door. Ming-Qiu fought like a man possessed, not with the cold efficiency that had built his reputation, but with something rawer, something that bordered on desperation. He moved through the estate's corridors not as a king defending his castle, but as a shield protecting something fragile behind him. He dropped attackers with precision shots. He coordinated his guards through barked commands and hand signals. He turned his home into a killing ground, using every architectural advantage, every hidden weapon cache, every trap he'd installed for exactly this scenario. But it wasn't tactical brilliance that drove him. It was the memory of a small voice asking, "Are you coming back?" By the time sunrise painted the smoke-filled air with gold, the assault had been repelled. Bodies littered the grounds. His eastern wall was rubble. The koi pond ran red with blood that wasn't water. Victory tasted like ash. Ming-Qiu stood in what remained of his garden, his shirt torn and blood-stained, his hands shaking from adrenaline crash. Around him, his guards performed triage and secured the perimeter. But all he could see was the violation. They'd breached his fortress, his impenetrable sanctuary, the one place that was supposed to be untouchable. His head of security approached, limping. 17 hostiles confirmed dead. "Sir, we lost 4 men. Could have been worse." Ming-Qiu didn't respond. His eyes tracked the destruction. The shattered windows, the scorched walls, The garden where Zola had played just yesterday, now transformed into a battlefield. Find out who sent them, Minkyu said finally, his voice hollow. But he already knew the answer didn't matter. The attack wasn't the problem. The attack was the symptom. When he opened the safe room hours later, Adana emerged first, her face a mask of exhausted relief and simmering fury. Zola followed, her yellow dress somehow still pristine amid the chaos, her eyes scanning the destruction with that unnerving perception that saw too much. You kept your promise, Zola said quietly. Minkyu nodded, unable to speak. Adana looked past him at the ruined estate, at the blood and the bodies and the smoking evidence of violence. When she spoke, her voice carried no accusation, just weary, devastating truth. As long as you're this man, she said softly, danger will follow. Minkyu watched Zola wander to what remained of the garden, kneeling beside a broken flower pot with the careful attention of someone mourning something larger than petals. The child turned back to look at him. Some storms don't chase people, she said, her 8-year-old voice carrying wisdom that pierced him. They follow crowns. Minkyu stood in the wreckage of his fortress and understood with brutal clarity. Power couldn't protect innocence. Power attracted the storm. And as long as he wore the crown, everyone near him would drown. The estate fell quiet in the way graveyards do. Not peaceful, but empty of life. Cleanup crews worked in silence, removing bodies and debris with the efficient discretion of people accustomed to erasing violence. Contractors assessed structural damage. Guards rotated shifts with heightened paranoia. The fortress that had seemed impenetrable 48 hours ago now felt like a target painted in neon. Minkyu stood in his study, staring at reports he couldn't focus on. Numbers blurred. Names meant nothing. His empire, vast, profitable, untouchable, suddenly felt like a noose tightening around his neck. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Soft, deliberate. Come in, he said without turning. Adana entered, closing the door behind her with careful precision. She'd changed from her nightgown into borrowed clothes. Simple, practical, nothing like the terror-stricken woman from dawn. But her eyes carried something harder now, something resolved. We need to talk, she said. Minkyu finally turned to face her. About leaving. About survival. Adana moved closer but kept distance between them. Protective space, strategic separation. You saved us this morning. I won't pretend otherwise. But you also put us in danger in the first place. I didn't ask your daughter to save my life. No, Adana agreed. But you asked us to stay when we should have run. The accusation hung between them like smoke from the morning's fires. Minkyu had no defense. She was right. He'd kept them here not for their protection but for his own purposes, because Zola's gift was too valuable to release, too dangerous to leave unsupervised. He'd wrapped captivity in the language of security and called it mercy. Where would you go? Minkyu asked quietly. They know what Zola can do now. Sungmin wasn't working alone. Information spreads. By tomorrow, every rival family in Seoul will want either to use her or eliminate her. Adana's composure cracked. Then what are you saying? That we're prisoners forever? That my daughter can never have a normal life because she whispered a warning that saved a gangster? The word landed like a slap. Gangster. Not businessman. Not power broker. The truth stripped of euphemism. Minkyu absorbed it without flinching. I'm saying the danger doesn't come from geography. It comes from proximity to me. Then let us go. I can't protect you if you leave. You can't protect us if we stay. Adana's voice rose, years of suppressed fear finally breaking through. Don't you see? Your fortress fell. Your guards died. Your enemies breached walls that were supposed to be impenetrable. You're not a shield, Minkyu. You're a magnet for violence. The words struck something fundamental inside him. A truth he'd been avoiding since watching Zola kneel beside broken flowers, speaking about storms and crowns. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Adana's voice softened into something more dangerous than anger. Resignation. As long as you're this man, this king of blood and money, danger will follow. And everyone near you will pay the price. She turned toward the door, then paused. Zola's in the sitting room. You should see her. Minkyu found Zola on the floor, surrounded by scattered crayons. She'd arranged them in precise rows, sorted not by color family but by shade gradation. Reds bleeding into oranges, blues transitioning through purples. A spectrum organized with the methodical care of someone who understood patterns others couldn't see. She didn't look up when Minkyu entered, just continued her careful sorting, picking up a burnt sienna and placing it between rust and mahogany with microscopic precision. Your mother wants to leave, Minkyu said, not sure why he was telling this to an 8-year-old. Zola nodded, moving a periwinkle crayon one position to the left. She's scared, but not of leaving. She's scared of what staying does to me. Minkyu crouched beside her, watching her small hands work. What does it do to you? Zola finally looked up, her eyes holding that unnerving depth that made grown men uncomfortable. It makes me see things I don't want to see, like how people stop being people and become pieces on a board. How danger isn't something that happens. It's something that follows. She picked up a silver crayon, studying it in the afternoon light filtering through repaired windows. Some storms don't chase people, she said softly, repeating her observation from the garden. They follow crowns. Minkyu stared at her, this child who spoke in metaphors that cut deeper than accusations. You think I should give up the crown, he said. Not a question. Zola tilted her head, considering. I think crowns are heavy, and sometimes people forget they can put them down. She returned to her crayons, arranging the metallic shades in their own category. Gold, silver, bronze, copper. Minkyu watched her work, each careful placement a reminder that perception was a gift and a curse. Zola saw the world in gradations others missed. She understood that danger wasn't binary, it existed on a spectrum, flowing from choice to consequence. And right now, every shade pointed back to him. His empire, his power, his throne, the trap he'd built with his own hands. Minkyu stood slowly, his joints creaking from the morning's violence. He looked down at Zola, at this small prophet who'd saved his life and paid for it with her childhood, and felt something crack inside the armor he'd worn for decades. What if, he said quietly, I could make the storm stop? Zola looked up, hope and doubt warring in her expression. Can you? Minkyu didn't know, but for the first time in his brutal, calculating life, he wanted to try. The empire didn't fall in a day. It died in increments, quiet, methodical, invisible to everyone except the man orchestrating its dissolution. Minkyu began with the accounts. Offshore holdings scattered across 12 countries, each one a thread in a web that had taken 20 years to weave. He liquidated them one by one, converting power into currency and currency into silence. Money moved through laundered channels, ending up in places even his closest advisors couldn't trace. Then came the territories. Districts he'd controlled through fear and influence suddenly found themselves released from his grip. He didn't sell them, that would have drawn attention. He simply withdrew, let rival families drift in to fill the vacuum, confused by the lack of resistance. His lieutenants noticed first. You're consolidating, his head of security suggested during a tense meeting. Smart. Tighten the inner circle. Fortify the core. Minkyu nodded, letting the man believe his own interpretation. He was doing the opposite. He was erasing himself. The process took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of coded conversations and encrypted transfers. 3 weeks of systematically unraveling everything he'd built. Each decision felt like cutting away parts of his identity, severing the anchors that had defined him since he was younger than Zola, fighting his way up from nothing. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered her voice. Some storms follow crowns. Adana watched it all with wary confusion. She saw the meetings behind closed doors, the late-night phone calls conducted in languages she didn't speak. The way Minkyu's guards began looking at him with something approaching concern, as if their master was exhibiting symptoms of a disease they couldn't diagnose. What are you doing? She asked him one evening, finding him burning documents in his study's fireplace. Leaving, Minkyu said simply. You can't just leave. Men like you don't get to retire. Men like me don't survive retirement, he corrected, feeding another page to the flames. That's why it has to look like something else. Adana stepped closer, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. What does it look like? Minkyu watched his empire burn one page at a time. Death, defeat, disappearance. Take your pick. And us? He finally looked at her. Safe. Away from this. Away from me. For the first time since the night at the Hanul Grand Hotel, Adana allowed herself to believe him. The final night came without ceremony. Minkyu sat in his study, watching digital numbers shift on encrypted screens. The last accounts closed. The last debts paid. The last threads severed. His empire, vast, brutal, profitable, reduced to zeros and empty spaces where power used to live. His phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. You think you can just walk away? The voice was familiar. Park Ji-hoon, head of the Busan Syndicate. A rival who'd been waiting years for an opening. I already have, Minkyu replied calmly. You've made yourself weak. Exposed. We're coming for you tonight. I know. The line went dead. Minkyu set down the phone and checked his watch. They'd arrive within the hour. Professional. Efficient. Expecting to find a king on a weakened throne. They'd find something else entirely. The attack came at midnight. Not explosions this time, too obvious, too public. This was surgical. Silent entry through compromised security points. Assassins moving like shadows through corridors they'd been given blueprints for. Someone inside had sold the access codes. Minkyu had counted on it. He wasn't in his study or his bedroom or any of the places a king would be. He was already gone. Slipped out hours earlier through maintenance tunnels even his own guards didn't know existed. Adana and Zola were miles away by then, tucked into a safe house under names that had never been connected to him. The assassins found an empty fortress. They also found evidence of their employer's betrayal. Documents Minkyu had left behind, implicating Park Ji-hoon in dealings that would get him killed by his own allies. A final gift. A last move on a board he was leaving behind. By dawn, the estate was chaos. Rival families turning on each other. Power vacuums collapsing into violence. The entire network destabilizing without its keystone. Minkyu watched it all on a laptop screen from a coastal motel 200 kilometers away. He watched his empire cannibalize itself in real time. Alliances fracturing, territories dissolving, the entire structure collapsing without him there to hold it together. He'd built it to need him. Now it was eating itself in his absence. Minkyu closed the laptop, destroyed the hard drive, burned the SIM card. Then he walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at the man looking back. Someone he barely recognized. The tattoos were still there, the scars. But the weight behind the eyes had shifted. The crown was gone, even if the marks it left remained. His phone, the last one, a burner, buzzed with a single message from an untraceable number. We're safe. Where are you? Minkyu typed 3 words. Coming to you. Then he destroyed that phone too. By the time the sun rose fully, Minkyu had vanished. No body. No trace. No forwarding address. Rival families searched for weeks, convinced he was hiding, planning a return, waiting to reclaim his throne. They never understood the truth. The throne was ash. The king was gone. And the man who remained had finally learned the difference between power and peace. He'd chosen the harder path. He'd chosen to disappear. 1 year later, the wine on the table was cheap. The house was small, a weathered 2-story structure perched on a cliff overlooking the East Sea. Paint peeled from the shutters. The garden was wild, untamed by professional landscapers. Laundry hung on a line strung between posts, snapping in the salt-heavy breeze. It was unremarkable. It was perfect. Minkyu, though he went by a different name now, one that carried no weight or history, stood on the back porch watching Zola run through the overgrown garden. She was barefoot, her yellow dress replaced by practical shorts and a sun-faded t-shirt. Her hair had grown longer, pulled back in a messy ponytail that bounced as she chased butterflies with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd forgotten what danger felt like. She laughed. The sound still surprised him sometimes. pure, unguarded, free of the gravity that had aged her too quickly in his fortress. This was what 9 looked like when crowns didn't cast shadows. "She's gotten faster," Adana said, emerging from the kitchen with a tray of tea. She'd changed too. The permanent tension in her shoulders had loosened. She smiled more. The lines around her eyes came from squinting at the sun now, not from fear. Mingqiu took the tray from her, setting it on the small wooden table they'd bought secondhand from a shop in the village. "She's taller too. Children grow when they're not constantly afraid." Adana settled into a chair, tucking her legs beneath her. "It's remarkable what peace does." Peace. The word still felt foreign to Mingqiu, like a language he was learning late in life. But he was learning it. His days now consisted of ordinary things. He repaired fishing nets for local boats. He fixed roofs. He did odd jobs that paid in cash and required no questions. His hands, once used to sign death warrants and count millions, now bore calluses from honest work. At night, he slept without a weapon under his pillow. That had taken months. "Zola," Adana called. "Come have tea." The girl bounded up the porch steps, breathless and grass-stained, collapsing into the chair beside Mingqiu with theatrical exhaustion. "I almost caught one," she announced. "A blue butterfly. It landed on my hand for 3 whole seconds." "That means you're trustworthy," Mingqiu said, pouring tea into 3 mismatched cups. "Butterflies, no." Zola giggled, a sound that still caused something to catch in his chest. Evidence that children could heal, that innocence could be reclaimed, that his choices had mattered. She reached for her cup, then paused. Old habits. Her small nose wrinkled slightly as she leaned over the steam, inhaling. Her expression shifted through microcalculations Mingqiu recognized from a lifetime ago. Assessment, analysis, conclusion. Then she smiled. "It's safe." She said it simply, factually, the way someone might comment on the weather. But Mingqiu heard the weight beneath those 2 words. For the first time in her young life, safe wasn't a desperate hope or a fragile illusion. It was reality. There was no poison in the tea because there was no one left who wanted to poison it. No enemy circling. No power to threaten. No crown to follow. Just cheap tea in a small house on a cliff where nobody knew their real names. Zola drank without hesitation, chattering about the butterfly and the tide pools and whether they could walk to the lighthouse later. Adana listened with the patience of a mother who finally had time for small wonders. Mingqiu sipped his own tea, bitter, simple, honest, and watched them. This was what he'd traded his empire for. Not vigilance. Not protection. Not the constant calculation of threats and countermeasures. Just this, a child drinking tea without fear. A woman smiling at the horizon. A man learning that safety wasn't the presence of guards. It was the absence of need for them. The sun climbed higher, warming the weathered porch. Gulls cried overhead. Somewhere in the village below, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Forgettable sounds. Sounds that had once been impossible. Mingqiu set down his cup and looked at Zola, who was now tracing patterns in the condensation on the table. Still seeing the world in gradations others missed, but no longer burdened by what she saw. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes, those impossibly perceptive eyes, meeting his with contentment instead of concern. "The future," she said simply. "It looks quiet." Mingqiu smiled. Not the calculated expression he'd used to intimidate or manipulate, but something genuine and unfamiliar. "Good," he said softly. "Quiet is good." Adana reached across the table, her hand covering his for just a moment. A gesture of gratitude, forgiveness, and something approaching family. They sat together on that small porch overlooking the sea, 3 people who'd survived a storm by abandoning the crown that summoned it. The wine on the table was cheap. The house was small. The life was unremarkable. And for the first time in any of their lives, that was more than enough. It was everything. Some nights, Mingqiu still dreamed of the empire. Not the violence or the wealth or the fear that bent men to his will. He dreamed of the weight, that invisible pressure that came with being someone whose decisions moved cities, whose silence could end lives, whose very name was a form of currency. He'd miss it sometimes. The power, the certainty, the knowledge that he was untouchable. Then he'd wake to the sound of waves and remember why he'd let it all go. It was early morning, that liminal space between night and dawn when the world felt suspended. Minkyu sat on the porch with coffee that was too weak and bread that was slightly stale. Luxuries he'd once have had someone fired for serving. Now they tasted like freedom. Through the window behind him, he could hear Adana humming in the kitchen. A tuneless melody that meant contentment, not nervousness. She hummed while cooking now, while folding laundry, while reading books she'd never had time for when survival was a daily negotiation. She was learning to exist instead of just endure. Upstairs, Zola was still asleep, sprawled across her bed with books scattered around her like fallen leaves. She read voraciously now. Fantasy novels about worlds that didn't exist. Science books about how things worked. Stories where children were heroes instead of collateral damage. Her gift hadn't disappeared. She still noticed things others missed. The slight discoloration of fruit that meant it would spoil quickly. The shift in someone's tone that revealed their mood. The patterns in nature that predicted weather. But now those observations were curiosities instead of weapons. She used her perception to help the neighbor's garden grow. To find lost things for villagers who'd learned to trust the quiet girl with the knowing eyes. To understand the world instead of survive it. She was becoming what she'd always deserved to be. Just a child. Brilliant and strange and beautifully ordinary. Minkyu sipped his weak coffee and thought about the men he'd once commanded. Some were dead now, killed in the power vacuum his departure had created. Others had risen to fill spaces he'd left behind, building smaller kingdoms on the ruins of his. A few had disappeared like him, recognizing that escape was the only victory that mattered. He didn't mourn the empire. It had been a monument to his own fear, proof that he could never be the powerless boy he'd once been, starving in alleys and learning that mercy was a luxury for people who didn't need to survive. But Zola had taught him something his years of power never could. Survival wasn't about being untouchable. It was about being free to be touched without fear. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and amber. Minkyu watched the light spread, transforming darkness into dawn with the patient inevitability of time. Behind him, the house stirred to life. Zola appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair a wild corona of bedhead. She padded over and climbed into the chair beside him without speaking, their morning ritual. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up. "Do you miss it?" Zola asked finally, her voice still rough with sleep. She never specified what it was. She didn't need to. Minkyu considered the question, really considered it, the way he'd learned to be honest with her. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not the way you'd think." "How then?" "I miss knowing who I was," he said slowly. "Even if who I was wasn't good. There was certainty in it." Zola nodded, processing this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "And now?" Minkyu looked at her, this small prophet who'd saved his life and given him a reason to change it. "Now I'm learning who I could be." She smiled, satisfied with that answer. Adana joined them moments later, bringing fresh coffee and warm bread that actually was fresh this time. She kissed the top of Zola's head, squeezed Minkyu's shoulder, and settled into her own chair with the ease of someone who'd finally stopped waiting for disaster. They sat together as the village below began its day. Fishermen heading to their boats, shop owners opening shutters, children racing toward school with backpacks bouncing. Ordinary lives, unfolding without drama or danger. The kind of lives Minkyu had once thought were for people too weak to claim more. Now he understood they were for people strong enough to choose less. Minkyu reached for his coffee and caught Zola watching him with that penetrating gaze that still unnerved him sometimes. "What?" he asked. "You look different," she observed. "Lighter." He smiled. "Crowns are heavy. You're not wearing one anymore," she pointed out. "No," Minkyu agreed, looking out at the endless sea, at the future that stretched before them unmarked by territory or threat. "I'm not." Adana's hand found his across the table warm, calloused from honest work, solid and real. Zola went back to watching the sunrise, her gift perceiving beauty instead of danger for once. And Ming-Qiu understood with perfect clarity. He hadn't lost everything when he walked away from his empire. He'd lost what was killing them. The empire was power. This was life. And finally, he knew the difference. If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.